Soo-han tugged at the door handle, pleading with the man behind it to stop being so stubborn and have a conversation with him. Jo Yeon-seo gave no reply, sitting on the floor with his face buried in his hand to block out the scent of pheromones. The protagonist could not fathom why his husband was holding back and resisting a natural process. Though he had assured him earlier that everything was fine, he was still met with refusal, and the thought crossed his mind that the issue lay in his amnesia. Jo Yeon-seo declared that he was filing for divorce for his own good, but Soo-han was not ready to surrender so easily. The brunette refused to even hear of it and threatened to break down the door if it wasn't opened voluntarily. A few seconds later, the lock clicked, and a flushed red face peeked out, insisting everything was fine and there was no reason to worry. Soo-han could see that this was far from the truth, so he stepped forward, gently touching his husband's shoulder in an attempt to calm him. Although Jo Yeon-seo was an alpha, his pheromones were astonishingly sweet, almost cloying, precisely the kind the protagonist liked. Touching the man's face, the brunette asked a rhetorical question about his actions during his heat. Naturally, he didn't want his husband seeking out other alphas and was already furious at the mere suggestion. Soo-han simply smirked, inviting him to confront him directly, as this was precisely why he had asked for the door to be opened. Unable to restrain himself any longer, Jo Yeon-seo practically pounced on the brunette, kissing him and pulling off his clothes. He seemed to be in a rush, behaving clumsily, prompting Soo-han to pause briefly and ask him to be more careful. The blonde trembled involuntarily when the protagonist touched him, and it dawned on him that this was their first time together, despite being married for a whole year. Soo-han was taken aback by the realization, left to wonder just how terrible a person he must have been before the accident. He silently condemned his former self, even though he didn't truly know him. But in any case, the past 30-some years had been reset, and he resolved to grant himself some freedom. The fact that the protagonist managed to recover from such severe injuries was nothing short of a miracle. But behind every miracle lies a higher design. If everything had unfolded this way, there must have been a reason for it. Though what that reason was, he would have to discover for himself. Waking up in the hospital after a coma caused by the accident, Soo-han was told he was incredibly fortunate to be able to stand on his own 2 feet. At least that was said to reassure him, as one leg was still in a cast and suspended. But most importantly, it was intact. His brain was functioning properly, and memory recovery usually took anywhere from a few days to several months, so there was no cause for concern. Soo-han's diagnosis included multiple fractures, with only his face miraculously spared thanks to the airbag. 3 months had passed, and in total, the man had spent more than 10 weeks unconscious. That fateful day had seen record-breaking rainfall, and the accident was presumably caused either by a rock slide or a loss of vehicle control. No dashcam was found in the car, neither on the windshield nor the rear window. Perhaps it had been removed days before the incident, and the police intended to investigate this further once the victim regained consciousness. But now, their questioning would have to wait, as Soo-han remembered absolutely nothing. He doubted it was merely an unfortunate accident, as it seemed unlikely for someone in their 30s to be such a poor driver. Unfortunately, there was no one to ask about it, and since it was a single-vehicle accident, compensation would be limited, leaving him anxious about how to cover his medical bills. These musings were overheard by a nurse who had come to disinfect his wounds. Smirking, she told Soo-han not to worry. If someone like him was fretting over such things, then others might as well forego treatment altogether. Not fully grasping the joke, the man tensed up and then guiltily averted his gaze, wondering what his financial status was, what kind of job he had, and what he did with his life. It seemed as though everyone around him knew who he was, yet he himself was a complete stranger to his own identity. Summoning his courage, Soo-han looked at the nurse and hesitantly asked her who he really was. The woman stared silently at the patient, unsure of how to respond appropriately. Then she laughed and called him by his name, as if it held some profound significance. Soo-han was a well-known critic on the show Kitchen Player. Though this revelation meant little to the protagonist, hoping to jog his memory, the nurse found a video on her phone and handed it to him, suggesting he take a look for himself. In the video, Soo-han appeared stern and sounded even harsher, berating the show's contestants for their lack of culinary skills. Another video accidentally started playing, mocking him for his behavior, and the woman hastily snatched the phone back, stammering that there were many positive articles about the critic as well. She opened one of these articles and handed the phone to Soo-han again, but all he saw were headlines dripping with open disdain. Seeing the displeasure on his face, the nurse quickly reclaimed the phone and hurried out of the room, muttering that other patients were waiting for her. Left alone, the man exhaled in frustration, replaying the information he had just learned over and over in his mind. He was a leader and a merciless critic on a competition show, dispensing cutting remarks left and right without regard for the age or gender of the participants. They say dissociative amnesia often arises as a defense mechanism against trauma caused by external factors. And Lee Soo-han couldn't help but wonder what he was trying so desperately to protect himself from. The man couldn't understand what could have shaken him so deeply, or why no one aside from the medical staff came to visit him. Lost in these thoughts, he didn't even notice when a hospital worker brought him crutches, passing along the doctor's recommendation to gradually transition from the wheelchair. Smirking faintly, Lee Soo-han, without looking up, remarked that he felt as though he were being kept locked away. The worker didn't quite grasp the comment, pointing out that they were outside. Removing his hat, the man explained that he simply felt a sense of constraint, as though an invisible boundary prevented him from stepping beyond it. Deciding to change the subject, he asked where he might find his phone and personal belongings. It turned out they were likely with his legal guardian, and to the protagonist's great surprise, he had one. Typically, when a parent is appointed as a guardian, the patient's phone isn't confiscated, so Lee Soo-han grew even more curious about who this person was, where they were, and what they did, especially since they hadn't shown up even 3 weeks after his awakening. There were far too many suspicious elements, and a sudden thought struck him. The guardian could very well be the person responsible for the accident. Borrowing a phone from the nurse, Lee Soo-han searched his name online but found only his date of birth and information about his appearances on various shows. There was no mention of the accident in the news, as though someone had deliberately covered it up to keep any details from reaching the media. What disturbed him even more was the feeling that someone frequently visited him while he slept. Due to the sedatives Lee Soo-han took before bed, he couldn't open his eyes, but he was fully aware of another presence in the room. The protagonist began to speculate about the identity of this mysterious visitor. Were they his guardian or the one responsible for the crash? Determined to meet them face to face, one night he hid the pills and refrained from taking them. As he had anticipated, the figure appeared again, sat across from his hospital bed, and simply stared at him. Lee Soo-han skillfully pretended to be asleep, hoping the stranger would reveal themselves. However, after some time, the visitor began to leave, which sent a jolt of fear through him. Springing to his feet, he grabbed the person by the sleeve of their coat, demanding to know who they were and why they came every night without saying a word. The mysterious figure turned out to be Jo Yeon-seo, who visibly panicked when Lee Soo-han woke up. Realizing there was no longer any escape, Jo Yeon-seo turned and admitted that he was his husband. A week after his first meeting with the man who called himself his husband, the protagonist was finally discharged from the hospital. To mark the occasion, Jo Yeon-seo gifted him not with a bouquet, but with a succulent. A gesture that surprised the man, though he refrained from asking any unnecessary questions. The only thing that truly unsettled him was the complete absence of any mention of a spouse in his online search. Then again, Lee Soo-han wasn't a superstar, just a restaurant critic with a reputation for caustic commentary. However, digging deeper with a more specific search query, he found an article titled, "Workaholic Omega Marries a Cinderella." The piece described his husband, Jo Yeon-seo, as the only son of a company chairman, recently returned from abroad, and renowned as the charming heir to a major business empire. Lee Soo-han had to admit that the blonde was indeed strikingly handsome, and 5 years younger to boot. Unexpectedly, Jo Yeon-seo handed him a brand new phone and a bank card, the latter of which could be used freely as he wished. The man flinched slightly as the brunette reached out to accept the items, making both of them feel an awkward tension. A few days earlier, a new laptop had been delivered to the hospital as well, and by now, Lee Soo-han was beginning to doubt whether he'd ever be able to recall anything from his past. What baffled him most was Jo Yeon-seo's behavior, visiting him in secret for 3 weeks while fully aware of his memory loss. It was clear their relationship was far from perfect, but the protagonist couldn't help feeling a twinge of disappointment at just how strained it seemed. Once they arrived at the apartment, Lee Soo-han glanced around and concluded that neither of them had any sense of style. The space resembled more of a showroom than a home, and for a moment, the brunette even wondered if they had come to the wrong address. The absence of any wedding photos on the walls only deepened his suspicions. His thoughts were interrupted by Jo Yeon-seo's voice, as he showed him the room where he could settle in. The bed was a single, and what bothered Lee Soo-han even more was the fact that they slept in separate rooms, prompting him to ask if that had always been the case. Apparently, it had, though the blonde didn't seem the least bit upset by it. On the contrary, he explained that he hardly ever left the master bedroom, leaving the living room and other areas entirely at the protagonist's disposal. This made the man wonder if they were just a sham couple. After all, sleeping in separate rooms during a supposed honeymoon was utterly absurd. While inspecting the items in the room, Lee Soo-han stumbled upon a drawer containing his old business cards, along with his previous phone number. Bewildered by everything that was happening, the brunette grew angry and immediately went to confront Jo Yeon-seo. Hearing the knock at his door, the blonde flinched, but ultimately agreed to the request and came out to share a cup of tea. The first thing the protagonist asked was what had happened to his job. As it turned out, someone else had already been invited to take his spot on the program, and since it was unclear when Lee Soo-han would recover, the company had granted him a year-long leave of absence. Jo Yeon-seo urged his husband not to worry about anything and simply wait for his memory to return on its own. The brunette couldn't help but notice how his companion was constantly attentive to his comfort, but maintained a distance, as if they were mere strangers. At the moment, all he wanted was to at least get a basic understanding of the situation before he could truly relax. So Jo Yeon-seo had no choice but to answer some of his questions. Unfortunately, as his husband, there wasn't much the blonde could say, as most of what he knew had come from the insurance company. According to them, Lee Soo-han had removed the dashcam himself just days before the accident, making it impossible to examine. His phone hadn't been found at the scene either, and as for his number, if it were reinstated, acquaintances might eventually try to contact him, which would only confuse him further. After finishing his explanation, Jo Yeon-seo apologized for not addressing these things earlier, but Lee Soo-han remained silent. It all sounded reasonable, leaving little room for argument, yet he still felt at a loss over what could be done without a phone or dashcam. The blonde seemed to have already guessed that his husband suspected him of being involved in the accident. But given the unusual nature of the situation and the memory loss, he explained that he had to tread carefully. This time, it was Lee Soo-han who apologized, admitting that he might have hurt Jo Yeon-seo's feelings and expressing gratitude for his patience. Still, one question lingered in his mind. What kind of relationship did they truly have? Jo Yeon-seo's face grew even more sorrowful after realizing he was being suspected, and the subtle change in his expression was impossible to ignore. Considering that the blonde was 5 years younger, Lee Soo-han asked how he should address him. The man suggested informal terms of address, typical between close individuals, which visibly embarrassed and unsettled his companion. It seemed to make Jo Yeon-seo uncomfortable, so he declined and asked to be addressed as Sir. Not wanting to linger on what he deemed a pointless conversation, Jo Yeon-seo abruptly stood up, stating that he needed to return to work. Judging by his reaction, Lee Soo-han concluded that he wasn't entirely indifferent to him, and this realization brought him a small sense of comfort. The house, which once felt cold and distant, now seemed a little warmer. Deciding to take a shower, the protagonist discovered that everything around him was brand new, as if Jo Yeon-seo had been waiting for his return. While this was certainly thoughtful, the man was more concerned about where all the old belongings had gone. He hadn't been in the hospital long enough for such items to warrant disposal. There must have been another reason for this behavior. It was amusing how quickly his perception could shift. Only recently, Lee Soo-han had mistrusted his so-called husband, suspecting him of involvement in the accident. He had genuinely doubted him, but upon realizing that the blonde bore him no ill will, his suspicions vanished almost entirely. Almost absent-mindedly, Lee Soo-han found himself wondering what Jo Yeon-seo had been thinking as he arranged the new items in this impeccably clean bathroom. Clearly, they weren't very close, and Lee Soo-han couldn't help but ponder where they had met and why they had decided to marry. He also began to question the wedding itself. Was Jo Yeon-seo happy? Had he wanted to cry tears of joy? The brunette couldn't picture the two of them standing together, even if it had truly happened. The next day, Lee Soo-han woke up late, closer to lunchtime, feeling noticeably hungry. His husband was already at work, so the man decided to make breakfast for himself rather than ordering delivery. Opening the refrigerator, he found an impressive array of ingredients suited to all kinds of tastes. Assuming that holding a knife or skillet might trigger some memory, Lee Soo-han set out to cook. Unfortunately, the dish turned out so poorly that it was nearly inedible. Opting for something simpler, he tried his hand at boiling potatoes, but even that ended in failure. The potatoes were undercooked. Realizing that his culinary experiments were unlikely to yield positive results, he resolved to eat the food as it was. Yesterday, his mood had been decent, but today it seemed to have plummeted into an abyss. It was a horrifying and disgusting feeling for Lee Soo-han to think of himself as a man who could no longer do anything, and he began to fear that he might never regain his memories. He also doubted whether he would be able to fulfill his previous responsibilities once his medical leave ended. The company certainly wouldn't overlook such a situation, so Lee Soo-han resolved to dig up more information about the former version of himself. Entering a room that appeared to be a study, the man assumed it was his own, though he wasn't entirely sure and decided to look around first. He found a laptop that had clearly been in use and wondered whether Jo Yeon-seo had bought him a new one because the old one couldn't be found, or if it had been done deliberately. As it turned out, the laptop did belong to Lee Soo-han. On it, he found a work messenger, document editing software, culinary documentaries, and promotional plans for wine imports into various regions. The sheer volume of information made his head spin, but even back at the hospital, the thought had occasionally crossed his mind that he might have orchestrated the accident himself. Now, as he studied the old laptop, one thing became clear to Lee Soo-han. He definitely hadn't intended to die. It seemed unlikely that someone with such ambitions would choose to end his own life, especially considering the number of plans he had for the upcoming year. Closing the laptop, the man began searching for something else that might trigger his memory. Entering the storage closet, he didn't expect to find anything of value, but there was something after all. It was a wedding photo of him and Jo Yeon-seo, in which neither of them appeared particularly happy. The photographer must have found the session extremely awkward, but work is work, and money is money. Lee Soo-han's confidence from the previous day, that his husband bore him no ill will, was shaken. He had a clear sense that he had just opened Pandora's box, something that had been carefully hidden from him. The situation had grown increasingly convoluted, so the protagonist decided to take immediate action. He replaced his lost ID card and bought ready-made meals that only needed reheating. At the store, the cashier recognized him and mentioned it aloud, startling Lee Soo-han slightly. The woman commented that in real life he seemed like a nice man, quite unlike his stern television persona. Bidding the cashier goodbye, the protagonist headed home, quietly noting to himself that he had often heard similar remarks while in the hospital. People who had never met the critic and entrepreneur Lee Soo-han in person always said the same thing. The brunette grew curious about what those who knew him personally might think of him. His thoughts were interrupted by commotion near a bakery. He decided it would be a nice gesture to pick up some treats for his husband as a small gift. Returning home, he put the groceries away and settled in to wait for Jo Yeon-seo. When his husband finally arrived late that evening, moving quietly through the hallway, he looked visibly unwell, and the protagonist grew worried about his condition. Hoping to catch his attention, Lee Soo-han greeted him, startling him so much that he flinched. Jo Yeon-seo froze, his gaze fixed on his husband, his expression shifting from fear to embarrassment in an instant. Alarmed by his own reaction, the blonde quickly retreated to his room, slamming the door shut behind him. The protagonist could only watch him go, left utterly perplexed by what was happening. Glancing at the pastries on the table, the man decided he couldn't just let the situation rest, so he knocked on Jo Yeon-seo's door, inviting him to come out and have dinner together. He mentioned discovering a great bakery nearby and said he'd like to share the food he had bought. Unfortunately, there was no response from the room, which began to seriously irritate Lee Soo-han. He started pounding on the door with his fist, determined to get an answer, repeatedly asking Jo Yeon-seo if he was all right. After a while, the door finally opened, and the blonde peeked out, asking what had happened. It turned out he had been in the shower and hadn't heard anything, so the protagonist repeated his offer to eat together. Trying to avoid the invitation, Jo Yeon-seo claimed he wasn't hungry and began to close the door, but Lee Soo-han firmly held it open, refusing to let him shut it. Pushing the door wide open, the brunette laughed nervously, explaining that the pastries were far too much for him to handle alone and that he urgently needed someone to help him finish them. Jo Yeon-seo hesitated, clearly reluctant to engage, so the protagonist simply shoved the sweets into his hands, suggesting he eat them later. He added that he had picked the best ones and that it would mean a lot to him if Jo Yeon-seo accepted the gesture. Even for Jo Yeon-seo, it was a bit much, but he didn't refuse. After that, the two wished each other a good night and parted ways. Returning to the kitchen, Lee Soo-han chuckled to himself. Jo Yeon-seo might be the heir to a major corporation, but he acted like a frightened rabbit. Deep into the night, the protagonist had a dream, one of an intensely intimate nature. However, he wasn't entirely sure it was just a dream. The sounds were far too vivid, yet his body remained completely still and unresponsive. There was nothing pleasant about the realization that Lee Soo-han had become the object of someone's lustful gaze while he was unconscious. Yet in that moment, he suddenly wished it had been Jo Yeon-seo. Jolting awake, the brunette sat upright. Everything had felt so real that it stirred a strange curiosity within him. Quietly slipping into Jo Yeon-seo's room, he mentally chastised himself for such behavior. But he couldn't simply let it go. Jo Yeon-seo was the only one who had stayed by his side, and Lee Soo-han wondered if he, too, had dreams like this. Or perhaps it wasn't even a dream at all, but a fragmented memory from their past. After all, they were married. But judging by the blonde's reaction to even the lightest touch, that possibility seemed unlikely. Of course, objectively, a person his age couldn't be called a child, but given his demeanor, it was hard not to think of him as one. Lee Soo-han decided to keep his intimate dream a secret. If Jo Yeon-seo ever found out, he would likely faint on the spot. The next day, the protagonist attended a meeting with producer Jo. The thought of reconnecting with someone from his work circles had barely crossed his mind when he received a call from the woman, a former colleague from the show. The man greeted her warmly, surprising Jo, whose eyes practically sparkled with astonishment. Feeling slightly awkward, Lee Soo-han explained that his long hospital stay had left him unaccustomed to socializing. But that wasn't the real issue. The producer noted that the critics seemed to have changed drastically since their last meeting. After exchanging a few more words, the man placed an order with the waiter, asking for seafood pasta. Jo was visibly stunned and even joked, wondering if amnesia could alter a person's taste preferences. Lee Soo-han didn't understand what she meant, so she explained that he had never ordered seafood in places like this before. He used to say that improperly prepared seafood would have a fishy smell, making it impossible to eat. The protagonist had already deduced that the old Lee Soo-han had been rather picky, but now he was, in many ways, an entirely different person. The brunette, who remembered nothing, admitted as much to the producer, saying he was essentially a blank slate. Jo was taken aback by this revelation, fearing that he had forgotten even the most basic things. But fortunately, it wasn't that bad. Lee Soo-han could still walk and use cutlery, much to her relief. She sighed and admitted that, had she not known about the situation, she would have thought he was someone entirely different, merely resembling Lee Soo-han. His tone of speech, his facial expressions, everything had changed, so the protagonist asked her to share as much as she could about his past to help clarify his memories. Jo's mood shifted sharply, as she realized that if the critic regained his memory, it was unlikely they'd continue working together. But Lee Soo-han reassured her not to worry about that. He was the one who had asked for the details, after all. Returning to a lighter mood, Jo began recounting his past in vivid detail. It turned out that the real-life Lee Soo-han wasn't much different from his on-screen persona. He saw himself as superior to others, knew he was excellent at what he did, and skillfully balanced both his work and social life. Summarizing her words, it was all just criticism. His face burned with shame, though such a reaction was entirely uncharacteristic of the old Lee Soo-han. Throughout the conversation, there was a genuine sparkle of interest in Jo's eyes, which, in some small way, was comforting. At the end, Jo handed the protagonist a resume he had sent to them several weeks prior. Naturally, most of the information was already familiar to him, but the producer had brought it in an organized format for him to review. She expressed hope that Lee Soo-han would fully recover and return to work, promising to await his call. Back at home, the man began carefully studying the resume, and one section in particular caught his attention: his education. He had attended an overwhelming number of schools and moved frequently, almost as if he were running from debt collectors. His middle school appeared as though it were on the verge of collapse, while his high school charged exorbitant tuition fees. The abrupt shifts were suspicious, though perhaps his parents had simply been lucky and won the lottery. Unfortunately, he couldn't ask them about it now, so Lee Soo-han decided to inquire with Jo Yeon-seo later. After all, he was his husband. Meanwhile, Jo Yeon-seo had prayed countless times to the heavens to restore their tangled relationship to its former state. But he had never wanted it to happen like this. Listening to voice messages left by others on Lee Soo-han's old phone, Jo Yeon-seo grew increasingly upset. The current situation could have been an opportunity for his husband to free himself from their burdensome connection and start over. Yet, with Lee Soo-han still unable to recover his memory or complete rehabilitation, Jo Yeon-seo couldn't bring himself to leave him alone. When Lee Soo-han playfully called out his name, it felt to Jo as though he had been transported back 10 years, to a time when they were both young and carefree. That night, the protagonist had another dream. He was walking along the shore, waves crashing against him, threatening to pull him under, when suddenly strong arms wrapped around him, saving him from drowning. Lee Soo-han couldn't fall back asleep, puzzled by how vivid and lifelike the dream had been. Perhaps it was because he had been constantly trying to locate a beach near his middle school. In any case, he didn't have much time to dwell on it, as Jo Yeon-seo came home unusually late that night. Moving quietly, Jo slipped on his slippers and headed to his bedroom, silently resolving to stay by his husband's side until he recovered. The next morning, Lee Soo-han found a note stuck to the refrigerator along with fresh sandwiches that Jo Yeon-seo had kindly prepared for him before heading to work. The gesture both surprised and touched him, and he ate breakfast with unreserved delight. Considering that Jo Yeon-seo had gone out of his way early in the morning to make food for him, the protagonist concluded that his husband truly didn't hate him. Yet the question remained. Why did his husband keep such a distance, trembling like a leaf at the slightest touch? There were several potential reasons. Discomfort, an unresolved argument, or perhaps just awkwardness stemming from the fact that the post-amnesia Lee Soo-han had become a completely different person. Today, the man didn't have much planned, aside from a rehabilitation session. He couldn't help but think it was a little absurd to be living off someone else, waking up past noon and eating food that had already been prepared. Just as the protagonist began to feel useless, he suddenly remembered something important. A few days ago, after obtaining his ID card, he had visited the nearest bank to set up an electronic signature and obtain a financial certificate. Someone who had been a top manager at a major company must have accumulated substantial savings. Or so Lee Soo-han assumed. In reality, his financial history revealed an odd situation. His brokerage account was empty, and he didn't own any property. On top of that, his transaction history showed enormous sums of money being transferred to unknown accounts. The man couldn't understand who might have been receiving such large amounts, aside from family, but his records clearly stated that his parents were deceased. The more the protagonist learned about his past self, the more questions arose. For a moment, he considered hiring a detective agency to investigate, but quickly dismissed the idea. His memory loss had to remain a secret. Collapsing onto the couch, Lee Soo-han wondered if any of this had been leaked to a television program. He couldn't risk any articles or rumors surfacing, so he decided to do nothing for now and continue living as he had been. If a year passed and he still hadn't recovered, then he would have to take action. His memory remained elusive, and the only thing he could see in his dreams were crashing waves and the tender embrace of someone holding him. It didn't feel like a fantasy. It was far too real, and Lee Soo-han couldn't shake the feeling that it had already happened before. What he couldn't understand, however, was why he had jumped into the water in the first place. After that dream, Lee Soo-han found himself wanting to ask Jo Yeon-seo many things, like when and how they had first met. It felt as though his husband was deliberately avoiding him, leaving early and coming home late. Besides, Lee Soo-han, having grown used to sleeping in during his hospital stay, rarely woke up early enough to see him, and as a result, they almost never crossed paths. Even so, Jo Yeon-seo continued to prepare meals for him, but this couldn't go on indefinitely. Determined to change things, Lee Soo-han decided to wake up early, hoping to catch him. And so, one fine morning, the protagonist finally managed to catch his husband in the kitchen. Upon seeing Lee Soo-han, the blonde apologized for the noise, even though he had tried to be quiet. The brunette smirked and reassured him that the noise wasn't the issue. He then apologized in turn for making Jo Yeon-seo care for him so diligently while he didn't even see him off to work. Jo Yeon-seo flushed with embarrassment, but Lee Soo-han was genuinely grateful and wanted to find a way to thank him. Taking advantage of his husband's flustered state, the protagonist stepped closer, folding his arms across his chest and suggesting they talk. The blonde grew even more nervous, glancing at the clock and hurriedly claiming that he needed to leave for work. Clearly, it was still quite early, but Jo Yeon-seo fled anyway, eager to avoid the conversation that made him uncomfortable. He suggested postponing it until the evening, and Lee Soo-han agreed, only asking him not to stress and to take his time getting ready. Naturally, this advice was ignored, and within seconds, The front door slammed shut, leaving Lee Soo-han alone once again. Given Jo Yeon-seo's promise, Lee Soo-han expected that he wouldn't stay out late, but the clock had already passed midnight. It was obvious this delay was deliberate, meant to avoid the discussion, but Lee Soo-han was determined to wait for him no matter what. Suddenly there was a noise in the hallway, like someone had fallen to the floor. It had to be Jo Yeon-seo. But if so, why wasn't he coming inside? The door handle kept turning, and for a moment, Lee Soo-han feared it might be a drunk stranger mistaking the apartment for theirs. Opening the door, Lee Soo-han found his husband slumped against the wall, clearly unconscious. The scent of alcohol was unmistakable. Jo Yeon-seo had gotten so drunk that he could barely make it home. Unable to wake him, the protagonist lifted the blonde into his arms and carried him to the bedroom. His legs trembled from the strain, his muscles still weak, but he managed to get Jo Yeon-seo to the bed and carefully lay him down. Sitting beside him, Lee Soo-han caught his breath while the blonde continued to sleep soundly, unresponsive to any calls. As a precaution, Lee Soo-han murmured something about not jumping to conclusions before climbing on top of him and starting to undress him. He was only trying to help, to make sure Jo Yeon-seo was comfortable while sleeping, nothing more. Taking the opportunity, Lee Soo-han quietly asked if Jo Yeon-seo wanted to get rid of him. To his surprise, the blonde heard the question and shook his head in refusal, which delighted the protagonist. He didn't respond to any other questions, but when the brunette touched his cheek, Jo Yeon-seo shuddered and grabbed his husband's hand. He seemed to enjoy the touch, holding the warm hand tightly against himself and softly asking for more.